On March 9th, 2026, the head of the International Monetary Fund stood before an audience of finance ministers and central bank officials in Tokyo, in a room convened by Japan's Ministry of Finance, and delivered what may be the most direct economic warning issued by any major institution since the 2008 financial crisis. Serious. She told them to think about the unthinkable. She told them to prepare for it. Pause. The global media, for the most part, mentioned it in passing. You probably saw a headline about oil prices. Maybe you caught a segment on Brent crude crossing $120 a barrel. What you almost certainly didn't see was the full weight of what Kristalina Georgieva was actually saying. Not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a technical diagnosis from an institution that has been quietly watching this architecture crack for months. I've spent years studying how economic shocks travel, how they start in one corridor of the global system, a waterway, a pipeline, a currency desk, and how they arrive months later on the grocery shelves, in the mortgage payment, in the account balance of someone who has never heard of the Strait of Hormuz and has no reason to care about it. That's the part that rarely makes the news, and that's exactly what we're going to trace today. Because here is the paradox. The IMF, the institution that exists precisely to monitor and warn about these kinds of systemic risks, issued a public alarm, not through a leaked memo, not through a think tank analysis, in a keynote address on the record. Size, and the coverage that followed focused almost entirely on the oil price number, the visible tip, while the structure underneath it, the one Georgieva was actually describing, remained largely unreported. What we're dealing with is not just a conflict, it's a stress test of the entire post-1945 energy architecture, and the building was already sitting on sand. Curious, let me show you why. The Strait of Hormuz is 30 miles wide at its narrowest point. 30 miles. Roughly the distance between two mid-sized cities. Through that 30 miles, through that single corridor between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, flows approximately 20% of all the oil traded, globally by sea. 20 million barrels per day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Not a reserve, not a contingency supply. The active, daily operational oil that keeps refineries running in Tokyo, Seoul, Mumbai, and Rotterdam. And it's not only oil. The same passage carries approximately 20% of the world's seaborne liquefied natural gas trade. Qatar, the world's third largest LNG producer, has no alternative exit. Every molecule of natural gas that Qatar sells to Europe, to Asia, to the spot market goes through this strait. Serious. When that strait closes, Qatar Energy doesn't find another route. It declares force majeure, which is exactly what happened. Here is something that almost no outlet explained clearly. A 10% increase in oil prices, sustained for most of a calendar year, translates to a 40 basis point increase in global inflation. Informative. That's not an estimate from a think tank. That's Georgieva's own figure delivered at the Tokyo Symposium, drawn from IMF modeling. 40 basis points sounds technical. Here is what it means in practice. If your country's central bank was targeting 2% inflation, it is now dealing with 2.4. That may not sound catastrophic, but central banks that were preparing to cut interest rates, easing the burden on mortgages, on business credit, on public debt, now face a choice between tolerating higher inflation or maintaining rates that are already squeezing households and governments simultaneously. Size. Both options are painful. Neither is clean. And the conflict had already pushed Brent crude well past $120 a barrel before the end of March, which means the actual shock to inflation is not a hypothetical 10% scenario. It is several multiples of that. Concerned. Now consider what Georgieva was specifically warning about. Not just the price shock, the structural position of the global economy going into it. During her 6.5 years at the IMF, she had watched governments spend their fiscal reserves, their buffers, on successive crises. The pandemic, Ukraine, the cost of living spike. Each time a government spends to cushion a shock, it draws down the capacity it has to cushion the next one. By early 2026, many governments had not rebuilt those reserves. The IMF had been pushing this point for months. Replenish fiscal space during stable periods because the next shock will come. Serious. The next shock came. The Dallas Federal Reserve published an analysis in March, putting numbers to the mechanism. A closure of the strait, removing roughly 20% of global oil supply from the market during the second quarter of 2026, was projected to raise the average price of West Texas Intermediate oil to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in that quarter alone. Surprised? Not for a year, for a single quarter. 2.9 percentage points of annualized growth gone. Goldman Sachs estimated that traders were already demanding approximately $14 more per barrel than before the conflict simply to compensate for the elevated risk. That's a risk premium baked into every barrel of oil refined into every liter of fuel, every kilogram of fertilizer, every air ticket, every delivery. Size. It is a hidden tax on every economy on the planet, and it arrived at the precise moment when most central banks had the least room to respond. Here is where it gets structural. 84% of the crude oil and condensate moving through the Strait of Hormuz was destined for Asian markets in 2024, according to the EIA. China received a third of its oil via this corridor. Japan and South Korea, two of the world's most energy-dependent advanced economies, were deeply exposed. India, which had been quietly rebuilding its strategic reserves and diversifying suppliers, faced acute near-term exposure and pivoted toward Russian crude almost immediately. Curious. This is the geopolitics of logistics. When the primary route closes, whoever has the alternative supply wins, and in 2026, the country with the clearest alternative supply was Russia. The conflict did not just raise oil prices. It materially improved Russia's competitive position in global oil markets without Russia firing a single additional shot. Brookings analysts described the situation directly in mid-March. The strait was effectively closed. 0 tankers in a 24-hour window, compared to over 100 on a normal day. Surprised? It was not a risk scenario. It was the actual scenario playing out in real time. And here's what the mainstream coverage mostly missed. The oil is only the first layer. The same strait that carries 20% of global oil also carries roughly 45% of global sulfur exports. Sulfur is not an abstract industrial input. It is a direct precursor for fertilizer. And March 2026 is planting season in the Northern Hemisphere. Concerned? When fertilizer supply is disrupted in planting season, the food price impact doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives at harvest, months later, in the form of lower yields, higher grain prices, and knock-on pressure on every country that imports food with a currency that is already weakened against the dollar. Size. That's the part of Georgieva's warning that deserved the headline, not the oil price. The second-order consequence, the one that arrives quietly without a news alert. I want to make this concrete because every macro mechanism has a human address. When oil prices spike globally, the dollar tends to strengthen. Not because the United States is immune to the shock, but because investors move toward the world's reserve currency as a safe harbor. When the dollar strengthens, every currency that is not the dollar weakens relative to it. That includes currencies across Latin America, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the emerging market world. A Colombian household that buys imported goods priced in dollars, including fuel, pharmaceuticals, or electronics, absorbs that shock directly in their purchasing power, not because of anything that happened in their country. Size. Because of a 30-mile strait they will never see. This is precisely what the IMF means when it talks about asymmetric distributional fallout. Countries with stronger balance sheets and deeper bond markets can respond. Many cannot. The shock is global, but it does not land equally. Thoughtful. Now, the dilemma of the power. Policymakers in 2026 were not facing a single bad option. They were facing a set of options where each carries a significant cost. Option 1. Cut interest rates to protect growth, accept higher inflation. The consequence is that inflation, which central banks spent 3 years fighting at substantial economic cost, reignites. Savings erode. Political pressure intensifies. Option 2. Hold rates or raise them to contain inflation. The consequence is that economic growth, already projected at a modest 3.3% globally by the IMF, slows further. Governments that borrowed heavily during previous crises now service that debt at higher rates. Public investment contracts. Employment softens. Size. Option 3. Release strategic petroleum reserves to flood the market and cushion the price shock. The United States announced reserve releases in early March. The consequence is that those reserves, once released, are not available for the next shock. Concerned, and Georgieva's explicit message was that there will always be a next shock. There is no clean exit from this decision tree. There is only the question of which cost you distribute to which group and over what timeline. Thoughtful. 4. SC by scenarios as the situation develops. If the conflict reaches a negotiated cessation within weeks, the oil price shock partially reverses, inflation pressures ease, and central banks regain some room to maneuver. Markets reprice. The deeper structural vulnerabilities, the depleted fiscal buffers, the overconcentration of energy choke points, the underinvestment in alternative routes, remain unaddressed, waiting for the next stress test. If the conflict extends through the second quarter of 2026, the Dallas Fed model projects a 2.9 percentage point annualized drag on global GDP in that quarter, with compounding effects through the year as supply chain disruptions move through agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics. Size. If the conflict broadens to draw in additional actors or expands geographically, the energy disruption extends beyond oil and gas into rare materials, fertilizers, and maritime insurance frameworks. Shipping companies rerouting around Africa add 3 to 4 weeks to transit times on multiple trade corridors simultaneously. If the current configuration becomes a new baseline, partial closure, selective passage, risk premiums structurally embedded in energy prices. The IMF's forecasts of 3.3% global growth for 2026 and 3.2% for 2027 would need to be revised due onward. The World Economic Outlook, which Georgieva said the IMF was preparing for release, would be the document to watch. Curious, what does this mean for you? If you've been watching oil prices and wondering why they feel disconnected from the news you're hearing, why the economic conversation seems to lag behind what you see at the pump, on your utility bill, or in the exchange rate, the answer is that the mechanism is working exactly as it always does. The structural shock comes first. The public narrative catches up later, sometimes much later. The purpose of understanding this is not to produce anxiety, it's to produce something more durable, a framework. When you hear that the IMF chief urged policymakers to think about the unthinkable, you now know what she was specifically pointing to. Not a vague geopolitical risk, a precise mechanical sequence. Energy choke point under stress, oil price spike, inflation reacceleration, central bank constraint, fiscal buffer erosion, asymmetric distributional impact, currency pressure in emerging markets, food price lag arriving at harvest. Thoughtful. Each of those links in the chain has a name, a precedent, and a human consequence. And none of them required speculation. All of them were in the documented record, the IMF speech, the EIA data, the Federal Reserve research, the Brookings analysis, before the mainstream narrative assembled them into a coherent picture. That is exactly the function of staying informed beyond eBay's headline. Curious. The question I want to leave you with, and I mean this as a genuine invitation to think, not a rhetorical device, one is this. If the IMF, the Federal Reserve, Brookings, Goldman Sachs, and the EIA all had this analysis published and on the record within days of the conflict beginning, what would it take for that analytical layer to become part of the standard public conversation? Not as a niche interest, as ordinary economic literacy. Pause, think about that. And if the answer you arrive at makes you want to share this, I'd be grateful for that as well.